Welcome back everybody to Tenkara on the Trail. As I mentioned in my choosing a rod introduction, I was going to do this in 3 parts. This is going to be part 1, which is rod characteristics. Just as a reminder, part 2 is going to be on the situation, and part 3 is just me discussing each one of my individual rods and why I have what I have. So let's get started with part 1. So for rod characteristics, the main things that you're going to run into is length and the weight of the rod, obviously. Tenkara rods can come in many different lengths, anywhere from some of the tiny ones of 5 feet on up to 17 feet or more for Tenkara rods, and for some of the other types of rods that we'll talk a little bit about when I talk about my rods, can be much longer than that, well over 20 feet. So length's really the thing to know, depending on what website you're on. If you're shopping for American made Tenkara rods or American companies, they'll talk obviously in feet, but the rods, a lot of the times they're talking in metric systems. So you'll see centimeters or meters. So for instance, you might see a 360 rod, which means 360 centimeters or 3.6 meters. You might see it'll say, like a rod I have says a 53, which means 5.3 meters. So you might have to do a little bit of familiarization with the metric system, but 11, 12, 13 feet, which equates to 330, 360, and 390 centimeters is kind of the, I think, the common lengths for Tenkara rods, and a lot of it is personal preference and what you're trying to accomplish with the rod. A couple other items as it relates to the length of the rod. The first being the length of it when it's collapsed. So how portable is it? Obviously this, I think it's 9.8 inches. This is very portable and very lightweight and easy to pack. And for me, a lot of the stuff I do up in the wilderness, backpacking, multiple day trips, it's nice to have a packable rod. This one, not so much. Great rod. I just am not going to pack with it most of the time. And the difference, I guess, why would you own one like this then? First of all, is the long collapse length means the individual pieces are much longer, and there's fewer joints. So in general, it bends more gracefully, if you will, if that's a proper way to describe it. But it's easier for a long rod length to bend than it is for a short rod length to bend. Generally, a very small rod is going to be pretty stiff because of those short segments. So it's going to have a different feel, and it's not going to behave the same as a long, smooth rod as well. If you think about it, there's not as many overlapping joints, so excess material. So these rods for a given length tend to be lighter as well. So some some pros and some cons to having a long rod or to have a really short collapsed rod. The other item that I'll mention is multiple length rods. So you'll hear it called zoom rods or multiple positions. But what that means is when you extend the rod, the last 1 or 2 sections stay seated in the butt cap here. So you can fish it at 2 or maybe 3 lengths. So you fully extend it, and you leave the last piece or 2 are kind of hard set in there. They're seated well. So you can fish it at a short length, and then you could go 1 more section and fish it at the intermediate length, and then even 1 more section and fish it at the longer length. So that can be very versatile depending on where you're going. The downsides I'll say to that is generally they'll fish, it'll feel differently at each length as you're adding the length of it. As you're extending it, it can change the penny rating as well as that rotational moment we talked about, as well as the rod flex index. So all 3 of the things can change based on which position you're fishing in. So if you like if you like a particular feel, you might not like it as much when you go longer or shorter with the rod. It's just something to keep in mind. Very versatile. I own, I think 3 rods that go to different lengths. This one, the Traveler 39, and the Fine Power rod there. Again, part 3. But I like having them. Just it's something to keep in mind that they're going to fish a little bit differently. But if you're trying to be a minimalist and only have 1 or 2 rods with you when you're out hiking through the mountains, because you don't know what you're going to encounter, how big, small, and all that kind of stuff, or the casting room, it's nice to have that versatility as well. So that's really it for the length. So for the weights, again, they'll all list them either in grams or mostly in ounces in Tenkara rods and rods in general. So for mine, for instance, range anywhere from 0.6 ounces for my tiniest little rod up to 5.5 ounces perhaps for my carp rod. So pretty straightforward in that. They all sound pretty light, but if you're fishing one for all day, a few ounces can make a difference, or even a half an ounce can make a difference in how that weight is distributed, which we'll talk about next as well. So rod flex is the third thing, and that's going to vary a lot. So I have a tip section here. If you imagine this being the actual entire rod, you'll see, depending on the manufacturer, you're going to see designations such as 7.3 or 8.2 or 6.4 or 5.5. What that's alluding to is where does the rod, typically bend. If you think of rod and reel, characterizations or nomenclature, tip flex. So it's bending mostly in the tip section. That's like an 8.2 or a 7.3, meaning, I think of it as 70 or 80% of the rod, and that last 20 or 30% is where you're getting most of the bend. And it's not a percentage, that's just my pea brain, the way I think about it. And then a 5.5, for instance, bends more in the middle of the rod. More of the rod is bending. So the other terminology you might hear is tip flex, like I already mentioned. You might hear soft, which is, more of the rod is typically what people are alluding to is bending, so that more that 5.5 action. You might hear the terms mid flex or full flex. Again, tip flex, mid flex and full flex, where it's bending all the way to the handle. So a lot of different terminology in there, and what makes it really confusing or misleading perhaps is each manufacturer considers a 7.3 to be something a little bit different. There isn't really a standard across the manufacturers. So a 7.3 for one manufacturer won't feel the same as a 7.3, or bend the same, I should say, as a 7.3 from another manufacturer. So that can be tough to distinguish if you're looking at different manufacturers or different brand rods. So one way to solve that, and I want to give a shout out to 2 people specifically, but Chris Stewart of Tenkarabum. A lot of this information is on his website, and I'm going to put links in the description below for this information that I'm going to share, as well as Dr. Tom Davis of Teton Tenkara has some of this information as well, and I'll also provide links to the diagrams and tables that I'm referring to in this discussion. So one of the things to take out some of the differences or non-standardization across rods manufacturers is they came out with something called a common sense system. So what they do, and with Tenkara rods, in all this information again is on Tenkarabum's website, but he will lock the handle horizontal to the, so the rod is horizontal to the floor, and literally puts pennies in a little plastic bag and ties it to the lilian and measures how many pennies it takes to bend the rod. So if this was a 9-foot rod, the way they do it is how many pennies does it take to bend that rod 3 feet, so 1/3 of the length of the rod. So 9-foot rod, how many pennies to go 3 feet for that tip. Okay, so that's how many pennies. A lot of times you'll see on the websites it'll say it's a 20-penny rod or a 15-penny rod. That's what it's referring to. So the higher the penny rating, kind of the overall stiffer that the rod will be. It doesn't tell you really necessarily is where in that rod it's bending. It can bend all in the tip, or it can be bending through the entire length of the rod. So, but it tells you a general overall stiffness of the rod. Dr. Davis takes it a step further and uses a rod flex index. And again, I'll put links to this, and I'll show a section of his table up on the screen as well. So he takes that overall length, he takes the penny rating and divides it by the overall length of the rod in centimeters. So that, or I'm sorry, in meters. So that gives you the rod flex index. So based on the pennies and the length of the rod, that gives you a number. The higher the number, the faster action that rod is going to be. So I'll give you an example of why Dr. Davis came up with the rod flex index. So if you have two rods, let's say this one, this 9-footer is a 15 penny rod. So it takes 15 pennies to bend it 3 feet. If you also have a 21-foot rod and it's also 15 pennies, it means that same 15 pennies is bending that 21-foot rod 7 feet. So you can imagine that that long rod of 15 pennies feels like a noodle compared to a 9-foot rod that's 15 pennies. The third thing makes a really big difference when you're out fishing, and that's what Dr. Tom refers to as rotational moment. And if you think about it, that's how tip heavy the rod is. So if I have a given rod of, let's say, 2.5 ounces, it makes a big difference if that 2.5 ounces is closer to the tip, or if it's all, the majority of it is in the handle. If it's in the handle, it's going to feel extremely light. For rod and reel fishermen, they think of it as balancing a rod, right? You want a reel that weights the rod enough so the weight, the center of gravity is back towards the handle, and that makes the rod feel overall like it's lighter. So to solve that, he has rotational moment. So he takes the weight of the rod, so 2.5 ounces, let's say, and then he measures where's the center of gravity. So measures the distance, which is kind of like the radius if you think about it, from the handle where that center of gravity is. And so you just take that radius times the weight of the rod, and that gives you the rotational moment. So that number, the smaller the number is, meaning it's either lighter rod or that center of gravity is closer to the handle, so the radius is shorter. The smaller that number is, the lighter it's going to feel in hand. And if you're fishing for 3-4 hours, all day, half day, whatever, 3 days straight, that extra swing weight, if you call it, to equate it to rod and reel verbiage, can make a big difference on how tired you feel. So I have some rods I'll talk about in part 3 that weigh more than other rods, but you can fish them all day long because you don't feel it. The center of gravity is way down here, and it's really fine, light tip, so it doesn't feel as heavy. So those are 3 things: the penny rating, the rod flex index, as well as the rotational moment. All 3 of those things play an important role in how that rod behaves and how it feels in your hand. A couple other additional items that people consider is really aesthetics. What looks good, it could be the coloring, it could be whether it's sanded, whether it's rough, the blank is unsanded. So there's differences in there. As well as, really, if you look at some of my rods, and I'll talk again in part 3, have actual wood handles. Some obviously have cork that people are familiar with. Some have foam. And then you can get into rods that aren't technically Tenkara rods, and we'll talk about that in part 3 as well, that don't have anything there other than maybe a little non-skid. It's basically the rod blank. So what comes into play there is really your personal preference, what feels good in hand. Does it fit your hand? Is it non-skid? Does it get slippery when wet? Some people like the traditional cork, some like the durability of the foam. Some, for instance, might not like the camo. Some don't, the shape of the handle can be different. So you can see this one, a 2 camel hump, I think they call it. So fat to thin to fat. Some are like this Tenru rod, are just a cylinder straight. So depends on what you like, personal preference. So that's definitely something to consider. And about his price, that can certainly be a factor on considering what you're going to buy. You can find a $30 or a $10 rod on Amazon, and you can catch fish with it. You can also spend upwards of $300, $400, $500 on some of the premium Tenkara rods as well. So all depends where you're at, and you can find really good ones for a reasonable price. Manufacturer of the rod. So it's kind of a Ford, Chevy, Dodge sort of argument. Some people are very loyal to certain brands or from certain countries for no particular reason. My rods, I think with the exception of one, is they're all made in Japan. I've had you know, U.S. made or U.S. company rods that were, I think, manufactured in China. You know, my advice is try as many as you can, see what feels right. See what you like, see if the rod you know, who makes the type of rod that you're looking for, as far as all those characteristics that we're talking about. And then, of course, replacement parts kind of follow along with that if you do break a rod, and I'll actually do a video on breaking a rod and how to repair it if you've never done that. One of the other things to consider is replacement parts. If you break a rod, and if you do it enough, you probably will, but it's not a big deal. Some rods come with a limited lifetime warranty. Some don't have a warranty, and a lot of the rods that I have from Japan don't come with warranties. What I'll tell you though is you can still buy replacement parts for them, and even though they have a warranty, some other companies or some of my rods have warranties, but you still pay for the replacement. So I don't view that as a big deal. There are differences in prices perhaps, and a lot of times that depends on which particular rod you're talking about and which particular part of the rod you're talking about. But it might be as cheap as, you know, 15 to 20 bucks, or it might be 80 bucks if you break a handle section. So that's also something to consider, is the availability or how quick you can get replacement parts too, if that's of concern to you. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hopefully that was helpful in some way and not too nerdy. If you have other comments, please feel free to put them in the comments section. But until then, I'll see you in part 2, which is the situation.